Hi, everybody. It's good to see the faces that have shown up today, or at least the names. So Terry and I were awarded a year and a half ago a specialty crop block grant through the state to look at ecological strategies for weed management. As Terry said, I spend a lot of time working with beginning farmers. A lot of beginning farmers are focused on organic production. And I spend time working with established organic producers in the state also. And nutsedge has been a consistent issue when we have conversations with these growers as to what they're battling in the field, what's giving their crops competition, and what are they basically spending a lot of time and effort to deal with. So we started out with a survey of these growers to have them help us identify what the top 5 weed species of issue were for them in these low spray, no spray, or organic systems. And we applied for the grant with the goal of creating educational resources focused on developing farm-based strategies, recognizing that every farm is different. Every farm has different equipment, different methods for dealing with issues. And so we wanted not only to create just static resources for farms to use, but to create a decision-making tool for these growers to use when dealing with these weed species. Also, part of this project is to do a trial up at the Snyder Research Farm where we're looking at herbicides that are OMRI approved, so organic approved herbicides, and comparing efficacy of those herbicides with others, certainly recognizing that a conventional grower percent efficacy expectation could be very different than an organic producer's expectations, right? Through conversations, we've realized that even a small amount, say a 30% efficacy of something, could be worth it to an individual producer if they were even able to get that type of help in dealing with weeds or other issues in the field. So those conversations have been really helpful for us in determining our work here. So our survey showed that the top 5 weed species for these producers were smooth pigweed, hairy galansoga, thistle, large crabgrass, and yellow nutsedge. And so today's presentation is the first of these 5 that we'll be developing. These resources will also be put online. Terry and I are going to develop a website for this. And then all of the fact sheets and decision-making tools will also go on that website to make it easy for people to access. So here you can see we've got young yellow nutsedge seedlings. This is the best time to deal with them, right? They don't have an established root structure. They're easy to pull up out of the ground and easy to identify too, right? They've got the long leaves that are a point at the end, and the stem is triangular, right? So if we were to do a cross section of that stem, it's pretty unique in its structure. And that yellowish color really helps this stand out when it's coming up with other grasses. The root structure is also interesting with nutsedge, and it's really its advantage and its ability to reproduce in fields. But it's also a turf issue. But regular mowing in a turf environment is one way to manage it. When we're talking about this nutsedge growing in fields, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So in the root structure, we see rhizomes, and these are basically thickened stems that grow horizontally in the ground. And these can be reproductive structures. So if the rhizome gets separated from the main plant, a shoot can form off of that. Those rhizomes are energy stores, and so you can have reproduction there. And then the nutsedge also produces tubers, and so these are also an energy storage area, and this is our main issue with nutsedge in the field and reproduction, is this ability to produce these tubers, which can survive in the soil for several years before they're creating a new plant. So this graphic shows how in a short period of time, so this is 15 weeks of growth, and you see this star in the middle is one tuber that's in the soil. And in 15 weeks of growth of that plant from that one tuber, 37 shoots, so 37 individual plants can be formed, as well as 71 tubers that are left in the soil that are waiting to then become plants of the future. And so that's a significant reproductive advantage for this weed in the field. And you could see if you had just one tuber, you'd want to take action quickly. But we know that if you see one plant out there, you've got more tubers than just from that one plant. And so quick action at the beginning of the season when we start to see these seedlings pop up from the ground is the best course of action. But that's also a period of time where you have a million things to do. And so we recognize, right, adding this on to the list of all the other tasks that have to happen at particular times of the season can be difficult. But this is a nice image to remember, right? So when it's in the spring and you see that nutsedge seedlings coming up out of the ground, just think of this slide and all that potential that those seedlings have, and that should give you the incentive to manage it. So as I said, these tubers can survive in the soil for about 2 to 3 years. It's not exact, it can vary, right? Environmental conditions play a large role in these tubers surviving. If you've dealt with nutsedge in the field, you know that it breaks through black plastic and natural mulches. So, weed barriers are not a weed barrier when it comes to nutsedge. They just push through because they've got that pointy, more sturdy leaf. Composting does not kill tubers. So when you're actively trying to remove plants and the tubers from the field, it's better to get rid of them in the trash rather than putting them into the compost pile, because when you spread that compost, you'll then be effectively spreading the nutsedge everywhere else that you're putting that compost. And we can't rely on insects and diseases to handle this for you, right? So you need to really manage this weed issue yourself. So nutsedge does not like extended periods of drought. And so these dry periods are really critical times to deal with trying to bring those tubers up from under the soil to the surface. So they'll dry out and then they won't be able to produce a new plant. Nutsedge can get up to 3 feet tall. So any crops that are growing taller than that can provide some shading over the nutsedge, and that reduces the plant's ability to create those energy stores below ground. Any of those soil disturbances, so if you're tilling, right, thinking about those top 6 inches of soil to bring those tubers to the surface, and cultivation can bring up those tubers that are higher or closer to the surface of the soil, as well as disturbing any of those young plants. And so that drying out process will help reduce those populations of nutsedge. So timing that activity during a dry spell, right? With a lot of weeds, we see this, right? If you're doing, bringing roots of weeds to the surface of the soil just before a rain event, right? Oftentimes you'll get rerooting of those weeds. And so just thinking about those dry times as your tillage and cultivation times. Foliage can be killed by frosts, right? So we see the overwintering of nutsedge by those underground structures. And nutsedge doesn't like fumigants, right? And some herbicides. So we also know that nutsedge can serve as a host for some plant diseases of the crops that we're growing in these vegetable systems. Most commonly, we see issues with Sclerotinia minor. So that's like a lettuce leaf drop. It also impacts lots of other crops it's a soft, watery mold that it causes. But we also know that nutsedge can be an alternate host for cornstalk borer, southern root knot nematodes, and alfalfa mosaic virus. So if these are diseases that you're concerned about or issues you're concerned about with your crops, all the more reason to want to reduce that nutsedge population so you don't have that alternative host in your production areas. So some cropping considerations, thinking about dense plantings to outcompete the nutsedge. So again, focusing on the shading. ensuring that you have proper fertility for the crops that you're growing. Soil fertility doesn't impact nutsedge. It doesn't respond to nitrogen as much as your crops will. And so if your crops are healthy and vigorous, then they have a better chance of outcompeting the nutsedge and hopefully shading them out. Thinking about alternating your cash crops with a year of dense cover cropping in those fields where you have a persistent nutsedge population. It's a lot easier to deal with the nutsedge if you don't have a cash crop in the field with it. And really thinking about your crop rotations. What can you plant in those fields where you have nutsedge that's going to be taller, that's going to be able to compete with it and won't impact your yield as much as, say, if you had a lower growing crop like lettuce, that it would just be a real hassle to deal with, and ultimately you'd lessen your yields. And then also thinking about the equipment that you have. What equipment would you use for cultivation during the season, right? You've got those young plants coming up of nutsedge. What's going to give you that upper level soil disturbance without impacting the crops that you have in the field, so you can use your equipment to help battle the infestation. So handling nutsedge on the farm is a multi-pronged approach. It's a season-long, or it's an all-year-long approach with lots of different aspects to try to combat it. So we've talked about hand labor. We talked about cover cropping. Mowing can help deplete those energy stores if you have areas where nutsedge is growing that you can mow over time. Equipment sanitation is incredibly important. If you've got one piece of equipment that you're taking from field to field, then and you're not cleaning it in between fields, right, you're very likely to bring nutsedge from one area where you have it into other fields where you don't have it. And so maybe some of you can look back retrospectively and be able to connect the dots for where you had an infestation start and how it moved its way throughout the farm. So really taking that extra time to clean the equipment from field to field and from season to season is important. Considering your crop rotations, and again, that tillage and cultivation. And so, dealing with persistent weed populations is something that's really important to think about with your winter planning and your crop rotations and how things are moving throughout the farm. What makes the most sense in terms of all of these particular aspects in dealing with nutsedge. So what we would expect to see on your winter to-do list is that planning that we talked about, thinking about where do you have nutsedge growing and what plantings make the most sense to stand up to that nutsedge and hopefully shade it out. Consider your tillage and cultivation equipment for future use. When do you think you're going to do that? It's a little bit hard in terms of thinking about the dry periods because those are, we're looking at those more in the near future rather than the far future. And then just having that plan on how you're going to clean equipment that's come into contact with those fields where you have nutsedge actively growing. Your spring to-do list, again, cleaning that equipment, sanitation's a theme here. Planting your spring crops as early as you can, right? So they can get that growth going and maybe outcompete the nutsedge in terms of height, right? Thinking about how narrow your spacing in your rows can go in those areas. Thinking about your spring planted cover crops in fallow fields, right? Giving that nutsedge as much competition as it possibly can in those areas. And thinking too about late spring cultivation. That's when you're going to be able to disturb those young plants when they only have a few leaves. That's when they're much more susceptible to cultivation and drying out when those roots have been exposed to the surface. And then certainly throughout the spring, monitor those populations. Where are those new plants coming up? Make a note of it and have a plan of action on how you're going to handle those situations. In the summer, we'd want to see more of that dry weather cultivation to expose those tubers and the rhizomes to the surface. right? When we think about day length and how nutsedge is going to grow, right? We see that growth really happening before July. Once those days start to turn shorter, that's when we see more of the tuber production, right? It wants to get those energy reserves stored up so that way the next generation will be well fed and be able to survive. Thinking about any of those new plants that might be popping up, making sure that we're doing some cultivation to disturb them, or we're using that hand labor to pull those up out of the ground. And then checking those roots. What are you finding? That's the best way to learn about this crop or this weed in your crops and how it's reproducing, and thinking about that next year and what could you do better. Monitoring those populations, and again, back to sanitation with keeping the equipment cleaned between areas. The fall to-do list, if we've got a dry period, we'd want to see more exposure of those tubers. And again, I know this goes against what we talk about in terms of preserving the soil. And so this cultivation is really focused on those areas where you have an increased nutsedge population. And in those areas where you're doing all that cultivation, we want to think about how are you building up that organic matter in the soil in those areas. And that's where cover cropping can really come in nicely, right? Because you're trying to offset that disturbance that you're giving to that soil. Again, we're still monitoring the populations. We're still cleaning that equipment that we're using. And then we're moving into those fall planted cover crops in the fallow fields. And so thinking about termination too with your cover crops, right? If you're doing mowing to terminate your cover crops, right? That counts as mowing against the nutsedge. And gives you that potential again to deplete some of those energy stores and hopefully weaken that plant. So in terms of planning considerations, what types of questions would you need to be thinking about? So where are your infestations of nutsedge, right? And with that plan of knowing where your nutsedge is, thinking about how are you going to prevent it from moving to other areas of the farm? How big of an size or how big of an infestation is it? Right, so that's going to dictate the type of action you take against it. And so it might, this would be a good activity to delegate to somebody who's new, right? Send them out to teach them how to get the nutsedge out of the ground, and then let them have at it, right? Thinking about how the population of nutsedge has evolved over time at the farm, and really think about the whys to that, and then thinking about what changes you need to make to prevent that from happening in the future. And so, but also remember, what are you doing that's helping to suppress the population? And then coming up with a short and a longer term plan to deal with the nutsedge. So not everything is going to be, you're not going to eradicate it in one season. This is something that does need to happen in multiple ways over multiple years, and something that's probably going to need to be actively managed for a long time. So with this project, what you should expect to see from Terry and I is that website available online. So I'd imagine this presentation, which is being recorded, will find its way onto there, along with the supplemental fact sheet and a decision-making tool for management strategies with nutsedge. We'll have the Snyder research trials, which we'll do blog posts online about, but we'll also be having a twilight meeting up at Snyder. So if you're interested in seeing how these herbicides worked and compare them with glyphosate and others, you'd be able to participate in that twilight meeting. And then other resources for weed identification will go on there, and I think it'll just continue to evolve over time. But this is something that we're going to do for all 5 of the weeds that I initially discussed, and we're always looking for feedback. So we don't know everything. So if something's worked really well for any of you in terms of nutsedge, we'd love to hear about that and learn more about what you did and how that worked. There is a good amount of nutsedge work coming out of the South, but again, that's a different growing environment than here in the Mid-Atlantic. And so we do see some differences. So please feel free to reach out to Terry or I with what you're seeing when it comes to nutsedge and any of the other weeds. I think I saw that there were some, I don't know if there were questions or if it was just chat.
Yeah, Meredith, thank you for this great presentation. We have one question from John Cleaning. If you mow the nutsedge before the seed, are you stopping the production of tubers?
Oh, that's a good question too about with bringing up seed, right? So nutsedge it produces seed, but it's not its main way of reproduction, right? It's a very low percentage of the seed that's actually viable. And usually when you see the seed being produced, that's when the tubers and the rhizomes are really actively getting produced underground. And so, yes, you're interrupting that process with the mowing. Would you add anything to that, Terry?
No, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, seeds are not the preferred way of reproduction for nutsedge. It's mostly through the production of rhizome during the season. When the days start to get shorter, the plant is turning towards the production of tubers. But a good point is that really mowing can help also, because by mowing, you're basically preventing the plant to replenish, to accumulate nutrients. And these nutrients may be used later for starting to, for producing rhizome or for starting to make tubers. So mowing is really something important to consider as well, for preventing the plant to accumulate sufficient nutrients to develop tubers later in the season. So that's really something important. But the seeds, yeah, as you mentioned, Meredith, I know that Lynn and Mark are still here, so we can ask Lynn and Mark their opinion as well. But seeds is not really the seed is not really the best way for the nutsedge to colonize, a new environment. I don't know, Mark or Lynn, if you have anything to add, maybe from personal experience on yellow nutsedge.
I mean, I don't. I think you covered it. Yeah, with respect to reproductive output, it's the tubers that are the concern.
Yeah, and I don't have any experience with seed production and the viability and so on of that. I always think of it as a tuber issue. So no, nothing more to add.
Yes, thanks, Mark and Lynn. Maybe one question, and it's again for Mark or Lynn, but I mean, if you look at what's going on in the south, they're discussing not just yellow nutsedge, but they're mentioning also purple nutsedge, which is another type of nutsedge and as problematic as yellow nutsedge. Mark, I mean, in your experience, is it something that we may, like Palmer amaranth, which has started migrating further to the north, is it something that in the future we may want to be exposed to? I mean, this purple nutsedge.
So, never say never. And with climate change, all bets are off. But as of right now, I'm not aware of purple nutsedge in Virginia. So it hasn't moved up this far yet. I don't see any in the fields that I'm working with. So is it potential in the future? I suppose so, but we're kind of beyond its range as of right now.
So that's pretty good news.
I saw there was a comment in the chat about the website that I kept promising. So it is a promise. It isn't created yet. It is something that Terry and I are working on. And once that goes live, probably the first place we'll post about it is the Plant and Pest Advisory. So if you're getting the commercial ag updates for that, then you would see the announcement for the weed website once it's up.
On maybe something we can add also, Meredith, is that we focused today on yellow nutsedge because we decided it would be the first target that we would investigate. But we have quite a few other species that are part of the grant, of the SCBG grant as well, that will keep investigating, providing you ideas about how the weed ecology, the weed biology may help you to better control some of these weed species especially if you don't have chemical herbicide to do it.
Can I add one more? You know, you were talking about the seed production of yellow nutsedge, and you know, I think the seed is more of an issue with local infestation, meaning within the field, because it is such a small plant. Very little of that seed gets harvested with the crops. So I don't think it gets spread as readily that way. But I do think that there is the potential for seeds, you know, that are shed from the parent plant to enter the soil and come back the next year. But it's the perennial nature of the tubers that we're most concerned about.
Yes, thanks, Mike. That makes mowing even more important. You know, on the thing that we can mention too is that, if I'm not mistaken, but each tuber has the capacity of not just sprouting one single plant, but you can have multiple plant, nutsedge plants sprouting from a single tuber. So even if you're killing one plant, I mean, the tuber has still the capacity of producing new plants from, you know, from dormant bud on the tubers.
Hey, Thierry, I'll throw one thing out there, and maybe it's good you're not having to worry about purple nutsedge right now. Just like that work that Ted Webster did when he was in Georgia, is that yellow nutsedge and purple nutsedge are very different creatures, like under plastic and bare ground environments. So strategies like how they grow and develop, they're not the same. So you can't necessarily apply what you know about yellow to purple and vice versa. They're, because of their biology and ecology being a bit different.
Yes, thanks, Lynn. So I think we have to be grateful that we don't have purple nutsedge here in the region yet.